Thanks for watching this video on automating vRealize Network Insight with PowerShell and Python. My name is Martijn Smit and I'm the Technical Marketing Architect for Network Insight working at VMware. I will walk you through some automation use cases by using mostly demos of real-life scenarios that customers are using to automate Network Insight. But first, why would you want to automate Network Insight? Well, as you might know, Network Insight itself is a treasure trove of information on what's happening in your network. You can actually use that information to enrich other systems, like security monitoring systems, configuration management databases like CMDBs, or maybe even other networking management systems. The list goes on and on. You can both push and pull information towards and from Network Insight, and here are just a few examples to get your imagination going. For example, you can make data source management easier by bulk importing them or even integrating a configuration management database to add a new data source automatically each time a new networking device is added to that CMDB. In the application space, you can integrate automation systems like vRealize automation in order to push application context towards Network Insight whenever a new blueprint is deployed, or bulk import these applications at the initial installation of Network Insight. As mentioned, you can also pull information out. So for example, you can export the recommended file rules for an application via the API and then push them towards your approval process, or maybe even directly into a firewall. Another interesting use case in the security space is being able to pull out network flows from Network Insight and push them towards a security information and event systems to give that system just a little bit more context for threat analysis. This and a lot more is possible with the Network Insight public API. And this API is actually RESTful, so it uses the HTTP protocol. And the documentation for this API is built into the product itself. So you can open up the settings menu and actually open up the API documentation from there to show an easy overview of what API endpoints are available and how to use them, and also what are the results that you should expect back. There's also a cool mechanism to actually test out these API endpoints directly from the API Explorer. So you can, of course, go directly to the API and use the raw API, maybe use Postman to talk to it, or your own scripts. But we also have a couple of modules and SDKs available to make it a lot easier and also quicker to get started. One of these is PowerVRNI, which is an open source PowerShell module that I built a couple of years ago, which has most of the API endpoints available. For anyone that's using PowerCLI or PowerShell NSX, this module will feel really familiar. Another option is the Python SDK, which is also open source, and this SDK actually has 100% coverage of all API endpoints, as it's automatically generated from the OpenAPI specification whenever a new Network Insight version launches. You can find more information on these modules at their GitHub pages, which are also linked in the description below. But for now, let's move on to the demo. Okay, let's start with the PowerVRNI example. So what you're looking at is my Visual Studio Code editor, which I do all my development in. And this is actually running in a container. So this is pretty cool. So Visual Studio has the concept of remote developing. You can actually point it to a remote server and then connect over SSH and then execute the code on that specific remote server. But you can also run it inside a container that you're running locally on your laptop. And I use containers because then you get a completely clean system every time you rebuild that container. And just to quickly show you how simple that is. So there's a .dev container folder here with a configuration file in it, basically just pointing towards a Docker file and the extensions that I want to install inside this container. And then the Docker file itself looks like a regular Docker file. So you give a container image. So it will pull down this from the Microsoft PowerShell repository and use the Ubuntu image. And then a couple of things to update this container and install Git, for example. And then one thing I always do is to set the PowerShell gallery source as trusted. So when I install things from the PowerShell gallery, then it doesn't complain about it not being trusted because it's been trusted from the startup. Anyway, enough around that. Let's go back to the demo. So as I said, this is a completely clean environment. So there's no Power VNI installed yet. There's nothing except for a clean install of PowerShell itself and the the setting that trusted the PowerShell gallery. So first off, what I need to do is I need to install Power VNI, and consider it's available on the PowerShell gallery. I just use install module Power VNI, and now it's actually fetching it from the PowerShell gallery. And there we go. And after we've done that, we can import the module, and then we can start using it. So first thing I always show is the list of commands that you can actually execute. And using the get command module Power VNI command, then you can actually get a list of all the commands that are available. So all these commandlets are available from this Power VNI module. So you can connect to a network inside server. So this is the SaaS version because it handles authentication a little bit differently. You need to use a refresh token instead of credentials. But I'm going to use the Connect VNI server for now. And just connecting to my own network inside instance is the first thing that you should do. Give it a server address, a username, and a password. Bang, bang. And then this will return an authorization code. And from now on, every command that you will do will start using that authorization code. So it doesn't have to send out your credentials every time it does an API call. It just uses this authorization code. You can also see that there's an expiry attached to this. So after this specific date and time, then this authorization code will stop working. Then you need to refresh it. But it's good for a while. Okay, so first thing and then I want to do is I want to add a vCenter to my network inside instance. So for that, I'm just looking at the new commandlets, and then there's the new data source commandlet. And let's just have a look at what this does. Every command has a output for the get help command. So you can have a look at what the synopsis and the syntax and the description is. So you can have a look at all the parameters that are available for a commandlet. But I want to get even more detailed, and I want to get some examples. So also for all the commandlets there are examples available. So just do a get help and then command and then dash examples. You will get a bunch of examples here. So looking at this first example here, what this does is it gets the collector ID first. So with Network Insight, there are collectors that actually go to the data sources and collect the information, then send it towards the platform, so the UI. But you need to put that collector ID into a data source, so the collector will know that it should start collecting data from that data source. So in this case, it uses get VNI nodes. It's another command that actually just gets all the infrastructure nodes from Network Inside and then gets the ID from it. So I'm gonna steal this one and actually change it a little bit because I've got multiple collector nodes. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna change this where into that I want the IP address for this specific node to be 10.8.22. And then the output will be a internal entity ID for from Network Insight. So this is the ID for this specific collector. Okay, now moving on to the actual creation of the data source. Go back to the example and get the new VRI data source command. You can see the data source type here is vCenter in this case, but it can also be the Cisco switch or NSX manager or VMC vCenter, etc. So in this case, I'm just gonna get the vCenter, put in a username and a password, so the credentials for it. This is gonna be a read-only account on this vCenter. Get the collector VM ID that we just gathered, And lastly, we can either do a fully qualified domain name for the vCenter, or we can pass an IP address. In this case, I'm just going to do an IP address. And then lastly, we got to give it a nickname. In this case, I'm just going to give it a nickname vcenter.localhost-domain.local. Hit enter, and then it will create the data source, and then it will return the newly created information. So in this case, you will see a entity ID, which is similar to the construct that you saw in the collector ID. So this is the internal ID within Network Insight for this specific vCenter, and you can go back and use this ID to get information of it. So if I now go to Network Insight and refresh the data sources page, then we should see a newly added vCenter here, which is pretty cool. All right, the other way around is also possible. So we can remove the data source. So in this case, I want to get the VNI data sources and then only get the vCenter types. And as you can see, I've got multiple ones, so I also want to limit this. In this case, let's use the nickname vCenter.localhost-domain.local. Now you can see we only got one, and then the only thing that I need to do is remove VRNI data source after this this command. So it gets the data source information, then it passes that through remove VRNI data source, and it will actually remove it again. So no output, just a no output is a success. If there's an error, then it's gonna error out. But if I now go back to the data sources page and I refresh, then it is gone again. So that's a quick example on how to manage data sources for this. Again, the data source type can be anything, and all the data source types can be found in the get help and the examples of this commandlet. Okay, so that's a small introduction on how to use single commands to do your management for Network Insight. So you can go back and look at the get command output and get all the possible commands that you want to do. But we also have a lot of examples inside the examples directory. And one of the more interesting one is the application bulk import script, which actually takes a input CSV file and then adds multiple applications to Network Insight. So an application is just a construct of an application name and a tier, and then the VM names inside that tier. And this script basically does it for you. So this example gets a application CSV as input. It checks whether that CSV example exists, and then goes through that CSV and looks at the applications, whether it already exists or not. So it looks at whether it's already created this specific application. So this is this line. If it already has created that application, then it will get the entity ID, which I was referring earlier to. And if it does not have this this entity ID, then it will see if the application actually exists inside Network Insight. And if it does not, then it actually goes ahead and creates that specific application. Also logs it so you know what's going on, and then adds that entity ID to the in-memory variable, so it doesn't have to query Network Insight every time it wants to look up a application entity ID. Then it goes through the filters. So the tiers that I was mentioning, they have filters, and the filters basically decide which VMs are put in that application. So you can do that based on VM name. You can also use security groups, or NSX security groups, for example. And then if there's a security group in the CSV file, it will get that security group using a commandlet, and also checks whether that security group exists or not. If it does not exist, then it just skips over. Otherwise, it will use that entity ID of the security group to add into the filter. And the filters get used when the tier gets created. So then the CSV file also does VM names. So there's a list of VM names or a wildcard possibility that you have. I will show you the CSV file in a bit. And then it will actually look at there's multiple VM names. So if you put multiple VM names separated by a comma, it will split it out and then use the VM name separately. So you can see that it splits it out for that VM names column and then goes through all the VMs and then adds a filter per VM name. And then lastly, I've just got lazy and just removed the last or in this line, and then use the filter VM to get the bigger filter. So you can also use a combination of security group and specific VM names if you'd like. All right, so then a quick check on the filters. So whether the filter is actually being created. So if there's a VM name in there or security group, and then we are actually adding the tier. So in this case, we're using new vRealize application tier, and then going to the application for for the entity ID. So it Network Insight knows which entity ID this tier is going to belong to. We give it a name, and then we give it a filter, and then we go round and round and we go until that CSV file is empty. So how does that CSV file look? Well, it's pretty easy actually. So we've got 4 columns, one application column, tier column, security group column, and then VM names column. And I'm actually not using any security groups in this example. I'm just using 3 applications with different tier sizes. So application 1, for example, has 3 tiers. So application 1 3 times and then different tiers. And it's going to use specific VMs here. It's going to use a wildcard here. So the star is a wildcard. So it's just going to look for any types of VMs that have this in it. Same goes for the database server. And then the application 02 has only one tier called no tier, and then includes everything that has app 02 in it. And then the application 03 has 2 tiers, one web, one database. And again, wildcards for including everything that looks like these 2 VM names. So you can go ahead and do multiple VM names if you'd like, or just use wildcards in order to get everything from that specific application. Okay, let's actually just run this. Let's see what it does. Before I move on, let's double check whether the applications are actually empty. So if I look for PowerVRNI, then we've got no applications starting with PowerVRNI, so that's good. And then we can actually run this. Application bulk import. Let's execute the PH1 one actually. And then we've got the input for the CSV file. And that's it. All right, so now it's going through that CSV file, doing the application generation and the tier add-in. And it does this because I'm already connected to Network Insight. So if you're not already connected to Network Insight, you need to use that connect vRealize server commandlet in order to connect to it first. And then you can execute this script with your own CSV, and then it will turn up in Network Insight. So it takes a minute before applications show up. So I'm just going to hit refresh a little bit, go to the main page, and then go back. You can already see that there's at least one. So PowerVRNI, and here we go. So we've got 3 applications created. Application 01 with 3 tiers, application 03 with 2 tiers, and application 02 with 1 tier. So if I look at how this actually looks, you can see that the naming, so the wildcard is actually in here. So it just looks at all the VMs that has this specific name. Well, it's an example, so I don't actually have VMs that are called that, but again, one with the wildcards, and this one should be specific names. So we've got real specific names here, but again, it's an example, so I don't have the actual VMs in this environment. So this is a very quick way to add applications. So there's a bunch more examples to get some inspiration from. For example, one application creation coming from ITOP. So it looks at the CMDB called ITOP and then exports all the applications and then imports them into Network Insight. You can bulk import data sources, so add multiple switches at once. You can export flows, you can get bandwidth usage per IP address. All these examples, what they're trying to do is to just get you inspired on how to use multiple commandlets in a script wise to get what you want to do. So there's one more thing that I want to focus on before I close this one off, and that's actually the debug parameter. So every commandlet inside PowerVRNI has the debug parameter available, and it's actually very handy for API development itself. So you actually know what's going on and which API calls are being made. So in that case, VRNI is not just good to use PowerShell to talk to Network Insight, but you can also use it as an API developer. So for example, if I look at the VRNI data sources, and I just want to get the vCenter types. So this is fine, right? So I get three vCenters with their entity IDs, the nicknames, etc. But I do not know how I got there. So if I add the debug parameter, and then it will actually start reporting every step that it does. So you need to type yes to continue every time. However, the fun part is over here. So you see that it's actually starting to do REST API calls to a specific URL. So in this case, it's going to get all the data sources from vCenter, and then it will receive back a list of three vCenters inside these results variables. And then it will start querying all the specific details of these vCenters, because the result itself, the initial list result, will only include the entity IDs of these objects. Same goes for all the other entities, so like flows, VMs, everything that has a list will return, firstly, will return the entity ID, and then you can use that entity ID to request more information on it. So I'm just gonna let this go through. You can see the result coming back. So we've requested the information from the vcenter.lab in this case, and then got that back. And then we're going to do that again for the next vCenter, and then there's the NSXT vCenter, and then one more for the third vCenter, and we're getting all the vCenters here back here. And that's it. That's a quick introduction into PowerVRNI. Okay, let's now move on to the Python SDK. So this SDK is available on GitHub. It's open source, and this SDK is actually generated from the OpenAPI specification, the Swagger specification, directly from Network Insight itself, which means that it's got 100% coverage of all the API functions that are available. So this SDK gets updated every time there's a new Network Insight release. So it's always up to date. So to get started with this SDK is pretty simple actually. You just need to check out this repository and then add this directory in your Python path in order to import the right libraries. And then install a single requirement and then you're ready to go. All right, so for now I'm just gonna copy this URL and move back to Visual Studio. And I've got another isolated environment here, another remote environment here running inside a container. Just to get a clean workspace every time that I want to do something new. In this case, I've got a quick dev container JSON file, which then points to a Docker file. I'd like to get the Python extension in there. There's a remote environment, so I've put in the Python extension. And then in the Docker file, I've specified that I want to get a Python 3 container. And then I want to copy the requirements. So there's like a requirements file for the Python pip to install some extra modules. And then just a quick apt-get update and get all the requirement tools like Git in there. Upgrade pip and then install PyLint for Visual Studio Code. And then do the requirements. So this is will execute the requirements installation, and then I'll have my environment set up. So again, the building of this environment will take a while. So I've already pre-built it. So right here I'm using Python 3 for this. And I've got a clean directory here. All right, so let's start with cloning the GitHub repository. And there we go. Then let's have a look. So we've got that Swagger client directory here. So if I now export the Python path, workspaces, network inside, Swagger client, there we go. And we can go into the examples directory just to get a sense of how we need to do anything. So if I look at, for example, the flow exporter, that's a pretty cool one. And make some more room. Okay, so there's a few things to take notice of the header of this file, and there's a couple of Python libraries in here, but we've got a init API client file in here, an import, which is actually links back to a file, which makes it a little bit easier for us to initiate this SDK. So this is sort of an initialization file with a couple of functions that will make it a little bit easier. So we've got a get API client to differentiate between the network inside as a service and the on-premises installations, mostly because the NIS, as I call it, has a different way of authentication. So it uses a cloud services refresh token instead of just a username and password. We've got the on-prem API client that actually logs into Network Insider and then stores the authorization code token. And does the same thing for the NES, only it talks the cloud services portal. And then a couple of default arguments that we're using to get the credentials and get the platform details into the example. So all these arguments will be by default available inside the examples that we're working with here. So if I go back to the flows itself, and then start at the main. So every single sort of subject within Network Insight exposes itself as an object. So in this case, I want to get the search API object going. So I instantiate a search API object, which then can be used to search for flows. Just a logger thing. And then here's a filter string that we use to filter through that specific search. In this case, I want every flow that's tagged with internet and then coming from specific data center, and I actually need to change this one to my data center to get any results. And then we go back to getting a search request parameters in place. So we specify a entity type. In this case, we want flows. This can also be a virtual machine or a security group, for example, and then use the filter that was defined above. And then we want a page size of 100. So these pages will be ongoing until the search ends. So it will return 100 results, and then it would return a page number, a cursor, as they call it within Network Insight. And then that cursor can be used to call on the next 100 results, and then the next 100 results, and then etc. So this basically just does pagination. Here we actually define a search request, so with the parameters that we've defined so far. And then this is to open up a CSV file and put in a header with the columns that we're actually going to write. So we're going to write source, destination IP, and source VM and source security groups, and also the port that the communication, the flow is going over. And then we actually go ahead and execute the search. So we do this in a while loop, mostly because we're using with that pagination. So we want to make sure that we get everything, every page from the API, just to make sure that we've got a full result list. So this call actually goes towards the API and does the request. And then there's a response log here, and then we go through the results. So there's a sort of a JSON body that gets returned, and then inside the results JSON value that's going to be an array, which lists all the flow results basically. So the flow or the search API is an object, but we've also got an entities API object, which basically is used to resolve entities. So entity can be like a VM, a security group, anything that is sort of like an object, an inventory object within Network Insight, can be defined as an entity. And inside the search result, we will get back a entity ID, which then we need to resolve back to a name. Just to make it a little bit easier on ourselves, we want to have the VM name and the security group name instead of just the entity ID, because that's a little bit more readable. So we get the actual flow from the entities as well, just to get a little bit more information over here, using that entity ID that I was talking about. And then we log the call. We go to sleep a little bit just to make sure that we don't hit the API throttle. And then we look up the source VM name, sort of the same way, only this is using a function inside the utilities, the SDK utilities, which then just looks up a source VM name and then gets back with the VM name itself. Same thing goes for the security group. So if there are any security groups inside the flow, we go back and use the reference entity name to actually get the name of the security group instead of the entity ID of the security group, and then append it to the security groups as a sort of a list, because there can be multiple security groups attached to these flows, because a VM can have multiple security groups. And then after getting all the results, we get the source IP address, the destination IP address, and then the port display, and then the resolved VM names and security groups here, and then append it to the CSV file. And then here's that cursor that I was talking about. So if there's no cursor anymore, we've reached the last page, so we can actually break and close this function, this loop off. Otherwise, if there's another cursor, then we store that cursor and use that cursor to do the follow-up request, so get the next page. And in this case, I just want to get one page, because otherwise I'm going to be running this for a while, and just break right away. Just let me comment this for my OCD. Okay, so and that's pretty much it. So the arguments are being used here from that init API client. If you remember, we're actually getting that those arguments, the platform IP address, etc., from the command line here. So this is using the SDK init API client file, and we can actually go to the command line and run this script. So if I run this script with dash help first, then we actually get a good overview of all the options that we've got. So the arguments have been translated into a help file as well, so that's pretty cool. And then we can add the platform IP address. Well, this is going to be the IP address for the platform that I want to talk to. Username, yeah, lost domain, local, and then password. One bang. And that's it. So you can go ahead and specify the domain type if you'd like, but it's standard local. So and this is a local user, so I don't have to specify the domain type in this case. Let's just run this and see what happens. All right, so now it's fetching that page of 100 flows and resolving all the VMs and the security groups that are attached to it. And it's actually updating this CSV file. So you can see that this being modified. And you can see the total count is 100 of these flows. So you've got source, destination, IP address, destination, VM, and any security groups that have been resolved. In this case, no security groups. And then the port as how it will be displayed inside Network Insight. So this is a very quick way to export all the internet flows coming from a specific data center. So this is going to be your vSphere data center. But you can add more filters along the way here. Okay. Okay, so second example that I want to look at is the application backups. This example actually makes a backup of all the applications inside Network Insight, and then gives you the ability to restore them to a different instance. So we're using the applications API object here, which again is one of the subjects. If you go to the Swagger documentation, then applications will be a separate subject topic inside that that specification. So we initialize one of those objects for the application API, and then we actually go through and hit list applications. So we get a list of all the applications that are in the system, go through the results again. So this, you might remember this from the last results page, so the flows. And then we get the application details using that entity ID again. So we get the application name in this case, and then a couple more details, and we are actually able to list all the application tiers as well using the entity ID again. And then we will get a list of all the tiers and all the conditions that are in those tiers. So which VMs, which IP addresses, which search queries are used to form that tier. And then it's actually saved to a YAML file. So this is all the this is just a list of all the applications, and we are using that to store it into a YAML file here. So we initialize this applications API. We call the list API, the list applications API, and then per those entity IDs we get the application details, so the name, and then we go ahead and list all the application tiers. So get all the application tiers configuration, and then save that to a global variable, which we can use to write into a YAML file. So how that looks is actually pretty cool. Let me application backups, and again we can do help here because it actually has added 2 options, as you can see all the way down here. So we can have a file name towards the YAML that we want to write or read, and then we can have a backup action. So if do we want to save the applications from the instance that you're connected to, or do you want to restore it? Well, in this case, I just want to save it, so the default is fine, and also this this file name is also fine. So I'm gonna leave the extra parameters out, but you can definitely change those when you run this. And then application backups, and just hit it, and then it gets a list of all the applications. And this is the YAML file that gets returned from it. So we got a application called download services here. It's got 1 tier, and then all the tiers are listed beneath here. So we've got a search membership criteria, and then based on the name of a virtual machine, this tier is formed. So most of these are going to be VM names, yeah, again VM names, but there's also going to be somewhere one with an IP address just to show you how it looks. Yeah, here we go. So here we've got backup services as an application name. And then in the tiers, we actually have a IP address as the membership criteria. So this is the difference between like putting a VM inside a tier or putting IP addresses inside those tiers. Okay, and then you can actually go back and restore these applications. Oh, yeah, application backup action is a restore. And then it goes into a network insight and actually starts creating those applications again. All right, so this is a very quick way to get started with the Python API using these examples. So the examples are pretty extensive. There are a bunch of in here. So also like a configuration with IP tagging, so you can tag certain subnets as east-west traffic, for example. You can update the data sources. You can get a list of all the data sources. You can do a simple search query. So this one search actually for VMs. So here's the entity type, virtual machine, and then using a specific vCenter manager, for example, to get all the VMs inside that vCenter. But it's a good source to get some inspiration on what you actually want to do. And if you want to dive a little bit deeper into the SDK itself and start writing your own functions, there's actually a README file in the Swagger client directory. which then lists all the possible functions and all the classes as well. So you've got the applications API here, and you can do an add applications, and the list applications is in here as well. So the one that we used before. We can do authentication, data sources. There's an entity API, settings API, and all these functions come directly from the Swagger specifications from Network Insight, so it gets updated automatically. All right, so that's a quick introduction to the Python SDK. I hope you found this useful. Thank you for watching.